wait. Hang on. We're not the Borg. We're okay. We're Arsha and Gaia. Unfortunately, Resistance is actually just as futile to Arsha and Gaia, so, you might as well just surrender now. Sorry. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but your life as it has been is over. And you will spend the rest of your days watching 2-hour videos by an idiot. Okay, moving along. I promised I would, so I'm going to have 3 things to talk about before I get into anything. I want to mention something real quick, though. I actually have a note here. I will not be talking about Kes or Harry Kim in this episode. Okay? I'm saving that for the next one. Got that out of the way. Let's talk about 7 of 9 and Jerry Ryan. I promised I'd talk about her in this episode. Okay. They always knew they wanted this character. They really wanted to basically mix things up and add a new type of character to the regular cast of Star Trek. They wanted to, and I can't believe I'm saying this, do something really new. And I know that sounds weird because, you know, the idea of an alien that doesn't actually fit in is not exactly new with Star Trek. However, 7 is unique. I'll be talking about 7 a lot over the next 3 years worth of content. Hopefully not 3 real-life years. That'd be terrible, wouldn't it? But I'll be talking about 7 extensively over the next 3 years because she's going to feature so heavily and basically become arguably the number 2 cast member, with Janeway being the main protagonist, if you will, and 7 being the secondary. But the reason I bring this up here is because her uniqueness is the fact that you can do so much more with a survivor Borg drone who is not a Picard. Picard was a Borg drone for what we believe to be about a week, maybe a little bit less than that. That's it. And the Borg destroyed him, as I will be talking about more when we get to TNG and inevitably the movies. Annika Hansen was a Borg drone for... they actually list several not quite congruent numbers, but around 20 years. They say 19 years in this episode. 19 years. Ever since she was a child. I want you to think back for a moment, okay? I want you to picture when you were 4 years old. Can you do that at all? And I don't mean this as an insult. A lot of people I know do not have memories going back that far. Now, I do, but I actually have an unusually good visual and audio memory, as I've talked about before. So I remember a lot of sights and a lot of sounds from going all the way back to when I was about 2 years old. But even then, that's just vagueness, glimpses, images, and some things that lack context. Some things I wouldn't even know what they meant, if not for the fact that I have talked to my parents about them and said, "What was this?" And she, you know, Mom, really, explained to me, you know. So keep in mind that, like, again, imagine you remember up to you were 4, whatever it is you remember that, which may include nothing, and then the entire rest of your life was as a Borg drone. And that's how she is truly unique as a character. And for another reason that I'll be talking about later. Much later, actually, I think. I'm pretty sure I know the specific episode I want to talk about that in, but I'll get to that. Now, one of the things they did deliberately, 7 was actually originally supposed to show up in episode 1. That was the original plan, but they sat back and they said, no. That would be, I mean, if it was in a perfect world, that would be ideal, but they were dealing with real life, and they wisely realized that they had limitations, and one of those limitations was a schedule they had to keep. They wanted the entire summer to work on casting and hammering out and working out all the details of this character, and that was a good move in my opinion. And Jerry Ryan was one of the people who auditioned. There we go. I just lost the word for some reason. I don't have a good word memory. Jerry Ryan was one of the women who auditioned and basically knocked it out of the park kind of by accident. Now, don't mistake. Jerry Ryan is actually a very talented actress. And to be totally blunt, 7 of 9 is one of my favorite characters on Voyager because of Jerry Ryan and the fact that she just absolutely nails the part. But the thing is, she went on that set expecting to play a Borg drone. She was told that she was going to play a Borg who was going to have... She was under the impression, especially thanks to her agent, there was some unpleasantness about that, that she was basically going to be a Borg drone, stay in the prosthetics. You know, she had a very vague familiarity of what the Borg were, mostly thanks to the fact that First Contact was so recent in everyone's public memory. And she was going to be this drone, and she was going to say a few lines, and otherwise she was just going to be one of the collective. Now that's critical for why she got the part, because when she auditioned, and she did a lot of line readings, she did so with body language rather than what most actors do, vocal. Now, yes, a lot of actors do body language acting. I mean, duh, I do that, everyone does that. But the point is, most actors, and most actors will agree to this, do about 80% vocal acting, and the other 20% is how they present themselves. It's all in their tone, and their word choice, and how they pace each and every single word that comes out of their mouth. You know, all that stuff. She basically read it like a drone, but it was her body language that sold them. It is worth noting out, because, I mean, this was so, okay, bleh, I don't even want to talk about this, to be blunt, but I have to, so whatever. Yes, they put her in her sexy catsuit. Yes, they did it for sex appeal. No, I don't agree. Yes, Star Trek's been doing that since the original series. Whatever. Moving on, okay? I mean, that's the kind of thing that bugged people back then, and this is the late 90s here, don't forget. So, you think it bugged people back then. You should see the uprights people have about now, especially since feminism is the current thing that's circling the social grouping of people. I don't know. The social network, we'll just call it that. I don't mean like Facebook. I mean the network of sociality that exists in, at least in the United States here, of, you know, feminism and anti-feminism and extreme feminism and people who don't know what the word feminism means, but they use it as if they do, you know, blah, blah, blah. I've given my thoughts on that many times, and it's a cluster. Point being, imagine if a character like her came out now, and people would be like, oh my god, she's just sex appeal, which is a damned shame, because no, she isn't. 7 of 9 is one of my favorite characters because of the character, not her boobs. Okay? This is not complicated. She is an amazing actress. They did some interesting things with her character. She really portrays the role beautifully, and she's an engaging idea. Like I said, there's a lot you can do with someone who is basically primarily a drone, who has been separated from the collective. They've never actually done this before. Hugh was different. Hugh didn't actually really get separated from the collective. He didn't actually do what Seven did. His journey is distinct and unique from hers. Hugh became an individual through repeated and extensive efforts of people constantly working and striving in order to make him understand what the concept was, and then grew from that point, over the course of an episode, I might add. Seven, well, I'll talk about more about that as we go, but Seven is not that. She is unique, and awesome, I might add. That being said, I just want to mention one thing. I know I'm not alone in this. I actually think it would be really cool if she didn't just... this happens in The Gift, so it doesn't happen in this episode. But I think it would be really cool if she stayed in the Borg suit longer. If she had stayed in the Borg prosthetics, and if over the course of time, as the Doctor got better and better and working with the Borg technology, she was able to remove bits and pieces of her Borg exterior and interior, and was able to slowly, gradually reach a point where she had a more, shall we say, a standardized appearance, which would be a wonderful visual metaphor for her slowly regaining, gaining the sense of herself. Forgive me, but the point, Seven's journey has never been about becoming an individual or regaining her humanity. Seven's journey has always been about figuring out who she is, the new her. The her that was killed, for all intents and purposes, as you might expect, is gone. The her that was destroyed is no more. That was Annika and the original 7 of 9 tertiary, blah, 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 blah. This new person that she is now, that is her journey. That's why she's one of the reasons why she's so distinct from Hugh. She is on a journey to create a new identity, a new personality, a new feeling, thoughts. She is effectively a brand new person, with all this baggage from both of her previous lives dragging her down in both directions. So having that visual metaphor of her slowly gaining her sense of self, and indeed making sure that all the prosthetics did not go away, because that's not the point. She's not becoming more human, she's becoming more her. I would have liked that. Just my opinion. The one other thing I want to mention about her is that Jerry Ryan is absolutely amazing. I know I just said that, but I want to re-stress this. Jerry Ryan herself mentions how she had a hellacious time working on this role, and she really, really, really worked on it. And she got some advice from the director of this episode and the writer, actually, Brandon Braga, believe it or not. It was actually two writers. And that advice was basically think a very proper military Prussian general. Okay? And she took that brusqueness and that military perspective and really worked with it. And that combined with the fact that she was in one of the most uncomfortable things in the world, so uncomfortable it actually made her nearly and then actually pass out. They actually had paramedics on the set because of how badly it was getting. It was hot, there was smoke going around, that kind of a thing. So she actually used her discomfort to force herself into that kind of role. And once she had the template for how to act that way, when she was no longer that uncomfortable, she was able to do it easier. I will be remiss if I did not point out that, yes, she actually did wear a, what do they call it, a girdle? A thing that squeezes you in underneath the catsuit. And that was also uncomfortable. But I'm getting off the point. Let's get back to it. So, that's 7 of 9. I don't want to talk too much more about her now because, let's be honest, I have like 3 more years of content to talk about her, and trust me, a lot of it's going to be about 7 of 9. That's all I want to say about that for now. Let's talk about Cliffhanger Syndrome. I said I'd mentioned this several times as I've been going through the series. I kept mentioning, when I get to Scorpion. Here we are. Best of Both Worlds Part 1 was written not knowing how Best of Both Worlds Part 2 was going to end. That was pretty unique at the time, in television in general, but especially for Star Trek. It was basically the first time they really did that. When they did that, they did that for a lot of reasons, and I'm going to discuss those when we get to Best of Both Worlds. See, I'm already hinting at future episodes here. But the reason I bring this up is Best of Both Worlds was a incredible success. Debatably the thing that pushed Star Trek into absolute pop culture, as opposed to simply being science fiction popular. Then they kind of kept going with that formula, but not all the time. Time Zero they worked out in advance. Descent they worked out in advance. There's a few examples of this. But then they did Basics. Now, Basics was done without an idea how Part 2 would end, but that was purely because of the nature of the fact that the engine was being changed, right? I already talked about that. Scorpion is, therefore, not counting DS9, because we're leaving that aside for the moment, because, remember, this is all the same crew from TNG to Voyager, with some exceptions. Scorpion was basically the next two-parter after Best of Both Worlds that was deliberately done without, not writing the second parter after you finished the first one. And the thing that makes Scorpion unique is they did that deliberately because it worked before. In their opinion, it worked in Basics. And in their opinion, it worked back in Best of Both Worlds, because it did work in Best of Both Worlds, so there's no denying that. So they deliberately did that, and then spent all their time and effort on getting, nailing the 7 of 9 part. Good move, I might add. And then wrote an episode to complement her, basically. And I think that's why it worked. Here's the problem, and here's why I kept mentioning this over and over. After this point, it became doctrine. Now, I've said this before and I've said it again. I'm very against doctrine. I'm very against laws. I don't like the idea of A always equals B because I fundamentally don't believe that that is true. I believe that the individual circumstances of the individual circumstance and the individual time and the situation and the setting and everything that equates in, the billions upon billions of variables that go in, are what determine what A equals. Not the fact that you wrote down on a piece of paper that A equals B. Okay? Excuse me. I get upset about that topic a lot. My reason for bringing this up, though, is that Voyager has done several things basically because of doctrine. I've talked about this before. The ship has to be in danger. Doctrine. The fact that there has to be an A and a B plot, and the the B plot has to be about the ship. Doctrine. All that fun stuff. As a result of Scorpion, and arguably the episodes before it, doing the two-parter thing where the second part was not written before the first part was written, became doctrine. Now, that kind of worked out. There's three big cases where it really worked out. One was a Borg story. I don't actually remember the name of the episode. One is The Killing Game this season, and the other is Year of Hell this season. Now, in Year of Hell, it worked out because they already had the framework of the entire Year of Hell worked out. I'll talk about that more later. In Killing Game, it worked out because they already had the framework of what they were doing with the story worked out in Killing Game, so, no problems there. In other words, they weren't really doing it there, they were paying it lip service. But towards the end of Voyager and throughout Enterprise, it got worse. And it got to the point where they would write the first part and literally not even think about the second part. In some cases, or at least one case I can think of, I don't want to speak in multiples, but I know of at least one case where the first part was written, done, and then the people working on it left, and the new people had to then make the second parter, without any input or information on how to do that. Yeah. That's why I kept bringing up this whole two-parter don't write the second thing, because ultimately, if it wasn't for the doctrine thing, it wouldn't actually bother me that much. And in all honesty, in several ways, it did kind of weaken several of those other two-parters I mentioned, but I'll discuss those when we get to them. I also said that I would talk about the Undine, so I will. I'm going to basically condense all my discussions about the Undine right here, with the exception of when we get to that stupid episode I don't want to talk about. Now, the Undine are in many ways fascinating, and then Voyager does nothing with them. Didn't we just do this with the Voth? Now, don't mistake me, the Voth are actually way more interesting of a species than the Undine. The Undine are interesting because they're the Daleks. Now, okay, a lot of people, when they'd say that, they would be doing it as a derogatory term, as a sort of a slur. Like, oh, you're just copying blah. And I hate that. That's not what I mean, to be clear. But the same thing that appeals to me personally about the Daleks is the same thing that appeals to me personally about the Undine. And that is the level of extremism on display. The interesting thing about almost all cultures is extremism generally doesn't happen in, like, basically every culture. There's always grays. There's always balancing things. There's always dissenting voices and dissonance amongst the people, It is so rare to see a culture that is unified, and in so being unified becomes extreme. In actual fact, it can be argued that has never happened in real life. Debatable, don't want to get into it. But in fiction, it is explored every now and again, sometimes well, sometimes poorly. Now, the Daleks are a classic example of an extremism. And the extremism can be described like this. Everything that is not us deserves to die. No possibility of negotiation, no possibility of coordination. No matter what happens, it will die because it's not us, and that means it deserves to die. Anything that is not us deserves to die. I do a Dalek voice, but frankly, it's like 11 at night and I don't want to wake people up. I can do it. I can do a pretty good Dalek impersonation. Exterminate. So, yeah, and the funny thing about the Daleks is that voice and the way they do that whole word summarizes their species so beautifully, and yet so subtly. Exterminate. That really is what they care about. And so do the Undine. The Undine take it into an interesting direction, though. They are not literally copies of the Daleks. There's certainly some similarities, and I'm not going to deny that. But the Undine are genetically pure, and then biologically pure, and then technologically pure. Everything that they do is literally a byproduct of the same basic genetic code, which has spread throughout the entirety of their species and their technology until everything that they do and are is the same. You see? Therefore, anything that is not of that is wrong. It's shown so beautifully. I talked about this, with the way that even a few skin cells could so violently invade and literally eat Harry Kim alive. That speaks volumes for the mentality of the Undine, because that really is their mentality. They will do anything and everything necessary to extinguish and exterminate. I'll talk a little bit more. Well, I guess I could skip ahead, but I'll get to that in a moment. And so the idea that there is nothing that is not them in their space is horrifying. In a beautifully way, really. In a beautifully way. I know grammar, I swear. In a beautiful way, because of the fact that it implies so clearly that it wasn't always that way. That the Undine were originally one species amongst many species. There have been theories going around that fluidic space was not always fluidic. That they literally changed the way that their space was in order to make it more them. extinguishing, exterminating, burning, purging everything that was not them from their entire galaxy. I gotta pause for a moment to explain something. The galaxy is a big frickin' place. Even in Star Trek, which includes faster-than-light travel, and transwarp drives and all that fun stuff, a galaxy is gargantuan. Think about all those lives. Think about all those plants and animals and planets and stars and random bits of debris and anomalies, all of it wiped clean. Think how long that would take. Think how devoted and zealous you would have to be in order to ensure that at no point in time would any Undine think, I've destroyed enough of this planet. I mean, there's a few bits of rubble left, but I don't feel like finishing the job. That's the kind of thing you would see from basically any other culture ever. Individuals thinking, because they're not that committed to their particular cultural mindset. The Undine, on the other hand, would not stop until there was nothing left but dust, if not less than that, if they had refused to do anything less than atomizing everything that used to be there, to truly purge it. That is why they are interesting to me. That is why they pose such a threat to our galaxy, and that is why Voyager dropped the ball completely, because the Undine are brought up, forgive me, this is not an exact quote, but off the top of my head, there's Scorpion. They're mentioned once briefly as something that the Hirogen hunt, and then they come up in the dumb episode, who's I'm not even going to mention. You know the one I'm talking about. This is it. Imagine if the Daleks imagine if the Daleks were in Doctor Who. I know, stretch. And imagine if they were shown to be the galactic level power that they are on Doctor Who, and they only had 3 episodes ever, and they were never mentioned again. Wouldn't that seem off to you? But that is the nature of Voyager in a nutshell. But I don't want to bash Voyager, because this is a great episode. Truly, I really, really enjoyed this one a lot. Final note, though. It is a beautiful irony. There's a lot of ironies in this episode, most of them which are done deliberately, that the Borg adapt and change thought processes in order to survive and thrive, and the very thing that crushes the Undine is that they do not. The Undine are defeated because they are absolute in their conviction and supremacy, and we will do everything until something finally penetrates that. Think about how many centuries, if not longer, it has been since the Undine have lost anything. How long it has been since they have tasted any form of defeat. And they walk into a battle with one dinky little ship that by all means they should have been able to obliterate in 2 shots. And actually that's about accurate, they could obliterate it in 2 shots. And then they lose. 4 ships. Think about what that would do to you. And then they send, I forget how many, it's like 18 ships after them, and they lose the 18 ships. Think about how much that would completely... It would send such a crack into that overall iron will, into that zealousy, into that belief and absolute certainty. It's not even a belief at that point. They know that they are the most supreme being that exists, and then that is utterly and violently contradicted, and they can't deny it. They tried to deny it that first time. That's why they led that second attack. They're like, no, we are the Undine. Everything that is not us, the weak, in other words, must be purged. And then they lose again. And then the Undine flee, because they have no idea what to do about that. They have no way to compensate or cope with such a horrifying thought that we are not perfect. We are not undefeatable. We might be wrong. That's probably the only reason I will give this stupid episode a pass, because that stupid episode does... I should stop calling it... I can't remember the name of it. But it does show that fact. It's probably the only thing I really give that episode. It really shows the fact that the Undine were so culturally, societally, governmentally destroyed by the events of Scorpion Part 2 that they were willing to do things so alien to them, which is, again, ironic considering that's exactly what the Borg do here. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. The directing in this episode is beautiful. I just felt like sharing that. The pacing in this episode is beautiful. The pacing is very high tense. There's only really 2 moments of pause when you get down to it. One of them is the great scene between Chakotay and Janeway. Even that's not really a pause, which is why I kind of hesitated there. The only sign that I would then consider a real pause is the end. The scene in Leonardo's workshop, which I'll talk about last, of course. So the whole thing is just... Sometimes you're sprinting, and then sometimes you're like just jogging, but you're always keeping pace the whole way. And I know that's a weird analogy, but that's really this episode in a nutshell. See, I'm torn on this because they had great sound design, but they also kind of cheated. They used a lot of the sound effects and sound design and work, and this is also true of the sets and costumes and whatnot, that were already used and made and created for First Contact on a movie budget. So if you notice that the music is different and the sound is different and everything just seems kind of higher quality, that's why. They borrowed a lot of that from First Contact. Now, I'm not saying that's really cheating. I don't want to say that, because whenever I say cheating, I mean that as a very bad thing. It's just they used the situation creatively. It's almost a pity because it was so noticeably higher quality in overall presentation. I wish Voyager could have been that way from then on. Although that being said, they do kind of up the budget from this point on because Scorpion was such a critical success and financial success that they were pushed up in the priority of budget, so to speak. So that's a good thing. I love the obvious pressure on Chakotay. In the previous episode, it was really all about Chakotay and Janeway. This episode is all about Chakotay and 7 of 9. Now, Janeway does play a major role, don't mistake me, but the focus has very clearly shifted primarily to Chakotay and the pressures and stress and dealing with the situation he has to go through, and 7 of 9, which is good because we need to introduce this new character. It is worth noting, and some people, myself included, didn't really realize this at the time, that most people, or I'm saying this wrong, most people didn't realize 7 was staying on the show. Most people assumed she was a guest star because that's what Trek does. In fact, that's what television in general did at the time. It was very uncommon to basically add a new character this far into a show and basically not do any real preamble to that. That being said, there was a little bit of preamble. I just kind of missed it. In hindsight, they did this whole thing with Jerry Ryan, and she had the cat suit on. She was like, I'm going to be playing a Borg, blah, 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 because they'd already filmed, The Gift and whatnot. And I kind of missed all that. So walking into this, it was just like, But the focus on Chakotay is what I really want to talk about especially. I'm going to skip ahead a bit in my notes here. First of all, the first thing that happens is he has to command basically in absentia. Janeway is off doing her thing, so he's basically the commander, of Voyager, and having to deal with all the circumstances pretty much by himself, having to make his own call. Now, I've talked about this before. Remember Displaced? This is Chakotay, a man who thinks well in a crisis. So his whole thing, he actually really feels in his element in this episode. I feel like this episode and Displaced both kind of solidified my opinion of Chakotay, because he is on top. He never hesitates. He doesn't stress anything, or he does stress. He's constantly, you can see him being crushed under the weight of all that's going on around him. And the thing is, the episode never stops escalating. At first, he has to deal with the fact that he's missing his captain. Then he has to deal with the Borg. Then he has to deal with the Borg and the Undine. Then he has to deal with the Borg on his ship. That may not sound as horrifying as it does to certain other slightly geekier people, myself included, but there's a Borg on my ship should be roughly up there with there's a supernova exploding under my nostrils. Maybe worse, to be totally blunt. But here's the beautiful thing about it. The final escalation is not what you'd think it is. I mentioned how the escalating threat was in first part. In the second part, the escalation is all about the pressure and the threat that Chakotay personally feels. It's all about him, the character. Again, succeeding in the same way Best of Both Worlds did. Because it's all focusing on the person, and that's why it's so beautiful that the final escalation is not world-conquering threats or unending Borg, cyborg, doom ship blahs. You can quote me on that. It is the damage done to the trust between him and Janeway. It is the damage done to the relationship between the two characters. It is the loss of friendship between the two characters. That's the final escalation. He is pitted not against the Borg, which he is trying to handle, not against the Undine, which he is balancing, not against the rigors of commanding his own ship, which he is rising to the occasion of. He has to stand against her. And it's so very human. And that's what I like about it. I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead in my notes again. But another interesting little point here is that the coda at the end on the... I almost said Shakespeare. On the Leonardo da Vinci thing is, again, a wonderful usage of that setting. It's a shame that we didn't get John Rhys Davies in it as well, but whatever. He wouldn't have added anything to the scene anyways, I'll admit it. I just like seeing him. But it's a wonderful thing, 'cause it's the first real breath. You know, we have escaped, and yet there is still that feeling that we are still in danger. It is literally just a breath, nothing more. We are not out of danger. We are not safe. We have not won. We have endured. We have survived the Borg, just like it was intended, right? But that wonderful scene as the two talk, it's very subtle. I know several people watched that scene and thought, "Oh, thank God, they've patched things out." No, they haven't. Rewatch that scene, seriously. Or don't, if you don't feel like it, just take my word for it. Watch how they act to it around each other. Listen to the tone of their voices. Watch their body language. When they're talking about each other and the decision he made, they are very cool, very icy, I would almost say, very professional. At no point do they get accusatory or angry, but at the same time, all the warmth, all the friendship, it's gone. That relationship between those two people, not a romantic one, but the relationship between those two people has been irreparably damaged and, spoiler alert, will never actually recover. And that was by design, no less. The writers, especially Brandon Braga, was adamant that they showed that it was not resolved, that they were not, everything was not patched up after that. And I love the subtlety of the way they present that. Now let's go way back to the top of my notes here again. Another thing about the Chakotay thing and the focus on him. Chakotay was also in a bit of a no-win scenario in this situation. See, the thing is, and a lot of people don't understand this, a lot of people don't understand why it is Janeway took it so hard, and why it is Chakotay was so adamant about not doing it. I'm going to explain both points here. Janeway took it so hard because in her final moments, all she could think about, and you could tell in her performance and in her lines, get this crew home. It wasn't the Alliance that mattered to her. It was what the Alliance represented. Her desperate need to make this work. Remember, we talked about that in the first episode. And then Chakotay, by her perspective, backstabbed her. Hurt her. Because he chose something else. And in so doing, he demonstrated through action, at least by her perspective, a total lack of trust in her. And then, of course, that also means that she feels she has now failed her crew, because she failed to follow through on the thing that she sacrificed so much to accomplish. Why did he make the decision he made? And so quickly, too. Well, the quickly is the easiest part to explain. He's Chakotay. I just talked about this. We just talked about this in Displaced. Chakotay is a man of action who is really good at commanding in a crisis situation. He was in probably, debatably, one of the most crisis situations they've been in to date. Really. I mean, Borg, Borg on my ship. Yeah, okay. So he decided under his best judgment, this is what we have to do, and he doesn't hesitate. You notice he doesn't get buy-in. He held a meeting not to ask them what they think. He doesn't take the Picard approach. He doesn't say, I want to know what you think. I want to know your buy-in. I want to know your thoughts on this concept. Even Riker actually did that. Riker and Picard both had a very fatherly approach to command. Chakotay doesn't really do that. Chakotay is much more a military commander. A little more Worf, if you will. I know that's a weird comparison, but think about it. Worf wouldn't sit down and say, I want you all to give me your opinions. He would say, this is what I have decided to do. I would like you to support me in this action. It is a different command style, and it shows clearly in the way he presents himself. And the only moment we actually see Chakotay crack a little bit is when he goes to the sickbay to meet the unconscious, comatose Janeway and basically apologize to her because he knows what he's doing and he knows how she'll take it. And the fact that he still does it anyways really strikes me very hard of how much he believed he was doing the right thing. Let's talk about why he did it, too. I haven't quite gotten to that yet. Why he did it. 2 big reasons. Number 1, militarily speaking, tactically speaking, not knowing the future, because, it was the right decision, but we only know that with hindsight. In the moment, I really, focused my thought. I did a little meditation to clear my thoughts. I was like, okay. And I agree with his decision tactically. And I'll explain why much later, but suffice it to say that I do agree tactically with his situation. From a military perspective, this is untenable. It needs to stop. It is worth noting that he was not simply kicking them off his ship into space. I mean, yes, that happened eventually, but only because he was forced to. And he still gave him a warning, I might add. He was like, here's what you want. Here's the technology, our part of the bargain. We're leaving. Bye. And I still agree with that decision. However, one other thing has to be mentioned. Jean-Luc Picard is debatably the single most iron-willed human being in all of Star Trek. I know there's some argument about that, and that's fine. But I would postulate that when it comes to sheer discipline, there's no one that surpasses him. This is a man who lent his mental discipline to an incredibly intelligent and incredibly skilled diplomat, Vulcan, which was not only considered acceptable, but was phenomenal. That's the kind of discipline Jean-Luc Picard has, right? And this has always been true. I mean, this has been true basically since Season 2, or, well, really since Season 3, when TNG started really getting its own. And I mention this because, First Contact, Jean-Luc Picard, with all that discipline, was horribly, horribly emotionally impacted by the Borg. The way they violated him is difficult to understand in real life because nothing exists in real life that is that bad. And we should be thankful for that, by the way. I'm sorry, there is nothing in real life that exists that is as bad as assimilation. Not really. It is the worst kind of mental and physical rape that exists, in my opinion. So Picard went through that and was devastated by it and was compromised, and that's the key word right there. He was compromised emotionally, mentally. His orders were suspect. First Contact showed this most clearly. Again, I can't wait to talk about that, but we'll wait later. Because I have to wait. And then my neck will act up. My neck was compromised by the Borg. Chakotay is not Picard. He does not have that kind of mental self-discipline. Sorry. I mean, no offense to the character. He's a great character. But he was also assimilated. Also against his will. Also used to do horrible things. He was forced to try and shoot at his own people, don't forget. And that was for a very brief period of time. But that kind of thing is so involatile. It is so violating that it's hard not to be scarred by that. He mentions it several times in this episode. The question I bring, and I do mention it as a question, is how much of Chakotay's decision to not trust the Borg do you think was rooted in that? In the prejudice of that? There is no denying he had insight into how a collective mind, a group of minds can work. Because he had that insight with Unity, with the new collective, the cooperative, excuse me. But how much of him not wanting to believe the Borg would hold up their end of the bargain was fully due to the fact that he was so antagonistic towards that very concept? And he shows this clearly. When he and Janeway are arguing in that scene in the sickbay, he is angry, and he is showing it. You can see his defenses slip, and his control just goes away, and he barely holds himself back from yelling at what he went through and what he knows they can do, right? Food for thought. No answers here. I guess since this is a wonderful segue, we'll go ahead and talk about it. I haven't even gone through my first page of notes. I'm already on my second page. Why did the Borg do what they do? Why did the Borg betray the crew? You know what? No, I'm gonna wait for that. I'm gonna wait for that because I want to build up to that point. There is a why there, a definitive why. So where was I in my notes? So one of the ironies I find in this episode is that one of the best viewpoints of the Borg as a species, as a thing, kind of comes from these two episodes, Scorpion and Scorpion 2, and Best of Both Worlds and Best of Both Worlds 2. The way they're presented in basically every facet in these two things, really, in my opinion, is where the Borg developed in my own opinion of them. I've talked about this before. The Borg are basically very interpretive, mostly because they're also very inconsistent thanks to the Voyager effect. So, that being said, efficiency does not equal tactics. I love the fact that they present the idea that the very concept of strategy is something that is alien to the Borg. And why wouldn't it be? Strategy is something that only makes sense if you think like we do. I'm sorry, I'm going to explain this so poorly, but it makes so much sense in my head the way the Borg think, which is probably terrifying. They would approach a situation and they would say, okay, we will move enough units to this area to destroy the enemy units that are at that area, because we know their defenses and whatnot, and blah, blah, blah. Okay, that was insufficient, send more. They'll never send excess. That's why they only sent one cube, remember? To the Earth, twice, actually. Although the second time was a different reason, but we're not going to get into that here. They only sent one cube to Earth because, in their estimation, one cube was all that was necessary. And they were right, by the way. One cube was all that was necessary. It was only the strategy and tactics and long shot of long shots several times that managed to defeat that one cube. So, the idea of the Borg approaching the Undine problem with just makes perfect sense, and explains so perfectly why they were losing. Now, the other funny thing about that is it also shows the two other things that are very alien to the Borg consciousness at this point in time. Cooperation and the self-preservation. See, the cooperation thing is, several times they have to basically be strong-armed. Actually, they literally have to be strong-armed into allowing Janeway and Tuvok to interact with them on an individual level in order to accomplish what they want to accomplish. And yet, I'm explaining this so badly, forgive me. The idea here is that, to them, again, no strategy, the most efficient path forward is to just put you into the collective here, there we go. Okay, now we know everything you know, now we can work together as one unified whole. Because that's what's always worked, right? And if you think about it, that is what is efficient in the absence of new input. It is actually a state of total mental stagnation in its own weird way. And yet the Borg have proven, and before this I might add, that they are not actually truly mentally stagnant, because under extreme duress and circumstances they will alter the very way the collective thinks. They do accept the idea of negotiations. They do understand the concept of value in how they save Voyager. They do it again in this episode, which I'll talk about in a moment. They do allow for them to stay separate. They do produce a voice of the Borg in order to speak with them, 7 of 9. They do lots of things in this episode that are very, very not Borg. But they know about them. Of course they do. How many people they assimilated that have these concepts in them? These things are basically entries in a databank for them. So they don't really approach them the way you or I would. They approach them like it's an entry in a databank. Like they have no proper understanding of what they're doing. Which brings me to that self-preservation thing. At no point in time do the Borg think Voyager's plan will work, because the only plan that will work is wiping out all of the Undine. All of species 8472 must be extinguished. Because after all, that is logical. The only way the Borg will ever be extinguished is if every Borg was extinguished. All of them. Q snapped away, basically. It's one of the reasons why the Borg are so threatening. You destroy a Borg ship, that doesn't mean much to them. You can defeat a ship, you can defeat a fleet, but the Borg will endure. So they don't really understand the idea that we will defeat a lot of Undine and then they will retreat, because that's not logical. And that they try to adapt to this alien way of thinking of self-preservation being a priority, specifically to allow for this new concept of strategy to enter into the equation. One of the best ways this is shown is actually later on here, which I'm going to skip down again. You know what? No, I'm going to do these in order. I'm going to do it in order, damn it. So let's talk about one final thing about 7 of 9 in her introduction. It was basically retconned that 7 was initially introduced to the crew by the Queen deliberately in order to create a new Locutus. I only bring that up because it's one of those things that I find interesting, in that even with the retcon, that may not actually be true. It's also very heavily implied that there is no Queen active at this point in time. It is so heavily implied, in fact, that it's actually in pieces of the script that did not make it into the final draft, that there was no Queen active at this point in time. The original intent was that there was never going to be a Queen again. Then certain directors, certain producers, executive producers came in and said, no, we need like a face of evil for the Borg. We can't just keep talking to this collective voice, man. That's just boring, man. I'm actually not paraphrasing that badly. They basically said that the collective voice, the voice of unmitigating terror, That is, the collective's voice was boring, and they wanted a actor to play the Borg. And that's why that's why there's a new queen. Yeah, whatever. There's the Harry and Kim thing, there's the Chakotay thing. I didn't mention this, I just gotta point this out. Janeway, more than once, actually, but there's one big thing. She was willing to terminate the alliance based on, them wanting to assimilate them. Now, she was kind of right in doing that because the Borg's way of thinking was wrong. But let's be honest, that's not why Janeway was doing that. She just didn't want to have her mind linked up to the collective, and I don't blame her. I bring this up because for Chakotay, turning around and going back and losing 5 days of trip time, and the possibility of being, 5 days on a ship with the Borg on his ship was unacceptable. And I also kind of agree with that thought process. But I bring this up because both of them were willing to terminate the alliance over these things. The only difference is the Borg acquiesced with Janeway and didn't with Chakotay. This is why I mentioned the Kobayashi Maru thing that Chakotay went through during the course of this episode. And it's no wonder that Janeway saw it as such a betrayal, isn't it? Because Janeway stood her ground and succeeded. Chakotay stood her ground and failed. Not really his fault in that one, but I digress. Let's get on with it. So I want to talk about let's talk about the Borg thought process a little bit more. It is no wonder that the Borg were willing to adapt and do all these alien, non-Borgy, wrong things that they were willing to do in these episodes, because the Undine had no Borg way of thinking solution. Literally none. The Undine can show up en masse, quickly. They can travel quickly. They can destroy us quickly. They are just as devoted to extinguishing us as we are them, and they are winning. There's a scene where they list hundreds of cubes destroyed, billions of drones dead. It is no wonder the Borg were willing to do such extreme things, because the Borg way of thinking, again, and I mentioned this earlier with the Undine, failed. The Borg knew they were wrong. The beautiful irony here, as I mentioned earlier, is that the Borg adapted. The Borg said, "We are wrong. We must try something new." The Undine said, "We are wrong. Pies from the sky." And by the way, that's a second reason why the Borg are so damn threatening. Because they can adapt. Not just their technology, not just your weapons. They can adapt. And these two episodes show that beautifully. Now, I want to mention two things. Forgive me for geeking out a bit. I know, it's weird. But let me get my Klingon shirt a little bit more prevalent here. The cube did something that makes perfect sense in a weird way, because it is strategy. I am sacrificing my pawn so that my queen may live. To the Borg, they were now fully in the sway of understanding the concept of value, aka Voyager is more valuable than half the collective, and B, the fact that this cube could be used in order to salvage Voyager as a ship. That was strategy. That is not the Borg way of thinking. And yet they ram an Undine ship with the Borg cube. That had such an impact on me when I first saw it. They destroyed a cube just to save Voyager for that. That just spoke volumes about what they were doing. They ram a cube they ram the Undine ship at warp. They will be finding particles of those ships for light years, My God. But the other thing I want to point out is one thing this episode does, and one of the reasons why this and First Contact and Best of Both Worlds really solidify my idea of the Borg in my mind, is this episode, in a brilliantly subtle and rather underplayed way, emphasizes how ridiculously good the Borg are at what they actually are good at. Let's analyze for a moment, shall we? Borg cube, traveling at warp, damaged, heavily damaged, I might add. Voyager, traveling at warp, damaged. Borg cube has a matter of seconds to calculate exactly how to transport a large chunk of the cube into Voyager and into the cargo bay in such an exact way so that it doesn't actually interfere with the cargo bay, and indeed can more or less within seconds be adjusted to adapt to the new technology of Voyager, and also to get all the people, or at least a sufficient number of drones that were considered valuable, the primary drone, that would be 7 of 9, and the two people they're working with, Tuvok and Janeway, onto there as quickly and efficiently as possible. And they do this at warp, in seconds, under attack, while preparing to ram the other ship. That is a level of precision and skill that is monumental. That's one of the reasons the Borg are so damn deadly. When they actually are doing what they're good at. Whew. No, resistance is futile. Now, real brief note here. There's a lot of battle scenes in this episode. I mentioned the budget went up, and they saved a lot of budget for this two-parter. Two-parters in general actually have a kind of a budget clause, and basically you get more money to spend in a two-parter than you would in 2 episodes. It's weird how it works. But suffice it to say that it's really on display here. Rewatch some of the battles if you will, or if you're watching these episodes with me, which is awesome, by the way. I'd love to hear about that. Rewatch some of those battle scenes. That's not all CGI. They actually did tons of really amazing, awesome stuff that I promised myself I wouldn't geek out about too much. I don't want to go into huge details about how they had the model for this, and they had the model for that, and they actually destroyed the model for this. And then they had the CGI ship coming out of the debris, which was created by the real model, and they did tons of cool stuff with it. So I just wanted to geek out about that for a little bit. Finally on page 2. Of course, I already talked about a lot of this stuff. So, a couple of little things here. I just want to mention that the scene... this whole scene is so brilliantly directed, but there's one scene that still gives me chills, and it's all emphasized by a single line. Bridge to Commander Chakotay. Scorpion. And the way she says that, it clicked instantly. The moment I saw that, it was like, yep. Total cognition, total understanding immediately of what was going on. And I love the callback. I love the way that was done. That's a good example of good writing, you know. Very brilliantly done. It's also a brilliant plan of theirs. Because their plan was never to try and get him hooked up to her with the Unity thing they still had. Good continuity, by the way. As I was actually on this side. In order to, like, control her or stop her, it was just to delay her enough so they could sever her link to the collective. Literally cut her off like Hugh was. That was the plan. Get her off, get her unconnected so the collective had no actual access to Voyager, and then get Voyager the hell out of there. That is a good plan. That is the opposite of a technobabble plan. It uses continuity, yes, which means I automatically give it like a +1, but regardless of that, it is using your cunning and using your disadvantages as advantages. Great idea, and really well executed. Why did the Borg betray Voyager? I said I'd get back to this. Because it was logical. The Borg were willing to do all these new things. Adapt, analyze, use new tactics, strategy. There's one thing I didn't mention. I'm just going to mention it here in brief. The Borg actually use a strategy they invent basically all on their own, specifically because they have reached a point of desperation even further than they already had. Seriously. 7 of 9 opens the portal into fluidic space, gets them in there. For some reason, fluid doesn't gush out of it. And... I guess there's not much pressure. And that is that. I mean, I don't know how to explain this. That is strategy. That is tactics. That is cunning. The Borg don't do that normally, but they have adapted so severely to this circumstance that they are willing to do something so wrong and so alien to them because they need it so badly, and it works. And then they're back to the status quo. That's why they betray Voyager, because in their mind, they're not actually betraying Voyager. In their mind, the only reason the deal and the negotiations and the strategy and the strategizing and the self-preservation and all these understanding of all these weird alien things was brought into active memory was because these circumstances here permitted it. These circumstances have been wiped away. These are no longer necessary. It's back to business for the Borg. And the speed and efficiency with which they betray the Voyager crew is very Borg, because there's no reason to waste time. We will now assimilate Voyager and get back to how we have always functioned and always will, because it is the correct path. And that's the beautiful irony of the Borg overall. They are willing to accept that they're wrong and adapt to it, but they will never actually admit that they're wrong. They would never actually say what we are doing is incorrect. Not without a major building up of a culture within the Borg collective, which I've talked about before in theoretical senses and whatnot. The point being, they could never do that. They could only ever go back to what they always have known, because that's how they've always functioned, and how they always will. Final thing here. And I'm going to mention this here because it's not going to come up again until Endgame. Yes, really. In this episode is the one and only scene in all of Voyager, I would go so far as to say, that really gives some reason why Seven of Nine would have a romantic interest in Chakotay. The only one. It kind of comes out of nowhere. For those of you curious, well, I'll get to it much later when that actually comes a thing. Suffice it to say, this is literally me making this up. Okay, this was not planned. I want to stress this. I've talked about this difference before. There's a difference between I'm making something up and I'm reading into something, okay? This is me making something up, okay? Chakotay violated her mind. Now, I know what you're thinking. No. There's no feminism, no allegories, nothing. What is important here is when he was in her mind, their minds were effectively joined. There is basically nothing that exists, especially in Star Trek, that is, with one exception, although that is also a murder of minds, so technically go away, that is more personal and more intimate than a genuine merger of minds. We see that in the mind meld, we see that in the collectives, we see that in the cooperative, we see that in the link, the Great Link. All of these things are deeply intimate, deeply personal, total sharing of self, being, memories, thoughts, emotions, all that stuff. He merged his mind with hers, even if only a brief period of time. It was also the period of time when, for the first time, basically, she was severed from the collective. It is debatably the first strong memory she has. The new her. 7. Not 7 of 9. I mentioned this earlier. Not 7 of 9. Not Annika Hansen. 7. It is debatably her first memory is that of him. And that connection of his mind. So it actually makes a lot of sense, and again, I know they didn't do this deliberately, that he would be the one she would be gravitating towards because of that connection that they already shared. Given her memory, she probably still remembers years later when that finally becomes a thing. Well, it's not years, but a ways later. A lot of things about him. Things he's not even probably aware he shared with her during that link. It's such a shame, actually, because if that was done deliberately, that'd be beautiful. And really well done, actually. There's so much potential there. Given what they have already been doing for over a year, I feel like pointing out, between Taurus and Tom, the slow boil, the building of their friendship, which has taken this whole year, which will then later blossom into a relationship. Why couldn't they have done that with Chakotay and Seven? Why did they have to just be like, and then they were together? Because that's kind of what they do. Final point. I mentioned before how surprising it was that Seven joins the crew, and I want to explain why. Nowadays, in modern television, big changes on a television show are actually the norm. That's been true for several years now, arguably about a decade now, but that's debatable. At the very least, it's been like 6 or 7 years since change happening on a television show is the norm. When Star Trek Voyager came out, and during the 90s and whatnot, where this was applicable, that was not the norm, unless you're watching some kind of soap opera, and even then, that's actually debatable. Seeing something genuinely, utterly shift in the show was very unusual. It's one of the reasons why Way of the Warrior, if I'm thinking of the right episode, which I might not, the big change episode in DS9 was so effective. There were actually 2. There was when they introduced the Defiant and when the Klingons went to war. Those big changes were surprising and more impacting than they otherwise would have been because it was so unusual for it to happen. And I think that's one of the reasons why Seven's introduction also garnered so much attention when she was on, because we see that last shot of her and it's like, oh, she's staying. And there's just that realization of, oh, change. This is basically the only change, it's actually in the next episode, the only change that happens across all of Voyager, really. It's this one big change right here. And I think that's one of the reasons it's so memorable. We're almost done with this 3-parter, because let's be honest, this is a 3-parter. We'll see how this resolves next time in The Gift.